Let me continue with the Chapter 8 lecture. This is part 2. We're talking about gender and have moved up to the discussion topic of sociology in the bedroom. Look at the issue of sexuality and how it is different in different cultures and over time and location. That what we might call a homosexual relationship was the norm in many societies, and that it didn't necessarily have a connotation beyond what it was. That in ancient Greece, for example, those relationships were readily accepted. That in modern times, if you look at those activities in prison, you might see that those relate more towards power rather than an expression of sexuality. The fact that you see such variations on sexuality suggests that there's no natural sexuality, but that wide variations could be the norm, and certainly the evidence is there to support that. The idea of sexuality and power might be the way in which, at least from a feminist perspective, sexuality is the factor that cements or guarantees hegemonic masculinity. In fact, McKinnon talks about the way in which compulsory heterosexuality, for it to work, requires the subordination of women. A middle-range approach might instead look towards the kinds of social relations that structure a society, that the idea of homosexuality is a type of social a social construction involving sexual interaction of persons of the same gender, and that even the idea of homosexuality is only a century and a half old. Whatever you may characterize as the behaviors, what the connotations that come with that may be peculiarly Western and a cultural practice associated perhaps more with power. When you look at, from Michel Foucault's research, look at the way in which the designation of homosexual relates to power. There is, in the Tony Kushner play, Angels in America, a scene where the character of Roy Cohn, which is roughly based on the life of the actual person, Roy Cohn, talked about what happens when it becomes clear that he has AIDS, and there is in the play a discussion between his physician and Cohn, and Cohn makes a point that he may have contracted HIV because of sexual activity with same-gender partners, but that he was not homosexual, and that it seems almost perverse, but when you think about how homosexuality is constructed in our society, makes sense that homosexuality relates to a lack of power, and that, as Cohn accurately points out, that he has been very persuasive and effective in a larger society, so that he in turn was not actually homosexual, notwithstanding the means by which he contracted the HIV virus. Also, look at the way in which, for the longest time, homosexuality was something that the government enforced, that it was literally a crime to be homosexual, until there was a time in which society's views towards that changed. And now you go to what seems to be a reasonable or natural outcome of that change, that you have so-called same-gender marriage. The idea that homosexuality was wrong and a mistake lasted even into the early 1970s, when it no longer was diagnosed as a form of abnormality. That even the sexual research done by Alfred Kinsey in the 40s challenged the whole idea that homosexuality was abnormal. Or consider sexuality from the perspective of teen sex, that the idea of virginity pledges, for example, and of hooking up seem to speak towards a certain idea about sexual activity that makes it either so very important or makes it so very casual. In either case, there is an emphasis on the extremes there. one telling point about the virginity pledges is that what they seem to do at best is to delay sexual activity and potentially reduce the number of sex partners, but that you'd still see the same number of STDs transmitted among those who wouldn't pledge. Early in this discussion, the author talked about the way in which masculinity amounted to an assertion of power, which required essentially the feminine to be subservient. Consider how it works in a larger society. The idea of sexism is that one's sex means that a person is more likely to receive a prejudicial treatment when it comes down to securing a job, for example. Look at the experiences of the researcher Larry Summers, who also worked as a central figure early in the early in the operation of Mr. Obama's first term, and also his experiences as a dean at Harvard's business school, where he has a discussion about why it is, or he wonders aloud why it is that there aren't as many women in the sciences and in engineering as there are in men, and he wonders whether there's a biological element to justify that, missing the point that these may be more an issue of the way in which hegemonic masculinity will ensure that women are kept in a subservient position. In effect, the problem that Summers stumbled on was his failure to recognize the widespread prevalence of sexism. That the sexism could end up unfolding in ways that are deceptive, that they may be so subtle that it's not even obvious, at least on first blush. Look at the way it is that when women start to overtake men in college in terms of enrollment, you still see women mostly showing up in, if you will, traditionally feminine fields of study, and that this idea of inequality is something that appears throughout our society. Consider sexism in the workplace or inequality at work. It's gotten to the point where such sexism causes a problem that as a matter of civil law, it is illegal to engage in sexual harassment, mistreatment of women. In effect, sexual harassment has also been extended to mistreatment of men and same-gender harassment. In all those instances, you're seeing an abuse of authority or power. That there may be two specific kinds of sexual harassment, at least recognized in the courts. The first one called quid pro quo sexual harassment, something for something, to translate from the Latin, which means that a woman might be in a position that unless she gives up, she engages in sexual activity, she might lose a job, or she would be able to gain a promotion, or allowed to advance within the corporation or business. The second kind of sexual harassment talks about a hostile workplace environment where we may not see necessarily a single woman being the target, but that there's an atmosphere that is degrading towards women, towards the roles that women can perform and play. Further, inequality in the workplace can show up in more subtle ways, such as the metaphorical glass ceiling. That why is it that you have so few women on the Fortune 500, the biggest successful 500 firms in this country? One of the ways that this seems obvious is the idea of the so-called mommy track, that as women are becoming competent and capable of building on their educational experiences, they end up exempting themselves from further advancement so as to have children, and that if they are capable of coming back, they may not do so at their same rank, or that the men who stayed ended up advancing beyond them, so that would put them at a disadvantage for further advancement. Whether this is necessarily overtly a way in which we're seeing masculinity dominate, I mean, it obviously does, but the question is whether or not this is hegemonic masculinity begs the larger question of why that would happen. But it's pretty clear that society expects the woman to be the one who would pull herself out of society as a norm rather than a man when it comes to the raising of children. In fact, flip it over, that you might have something called the glass escalator, that when a man engages work in a more so-called traditional feminine field, you'll see his advancement coming faster and in a more lucrative way than it would be for than for women. And finally, look at the way in which one option that women have to contemplate would be to opt out, to give up altogether on the idea of being able to compete. An option that grows vanishingly less likely or available for many women, since the norm for a family to function seems to require both parents working to be able to support a growing family. The last point relates to the policy section that appears at the end of the chapter, talking about women in combat. And for one thing, it suggests a purity of the role that has already been challenged successfully, that women have been involved in combat, maybe not necessarily in terms of shooting at somebody, but nonetheless have been in combat theaters for a while. And perhaps finally, and rather soberingly, that the risks that women encounter have more to do with the dangers presented to them by their fellow soldiers than from enemies. That periodically you hear of the sexual assault scandals that have been reported in various branches of the military, especially the culture of silence, which essentially works against even the disclosure of sexual assaults. So there are a few of the high points that appear in Chapter 8. Let me end that then as the video lecture for that chapter.